But we're going to be continuing on through Matthew, just like we've been doing. And this is section 6 of Matthew's Gospel as I've outlined these things. And I have titled that section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And again, that is largely from toward the end of chapter 20 of Matthew through to the end of the Olivet Discourse, that ends at the very end of chapter 25. So all of that is one section of Matthew as I've outlined these things for you. And so far, as we've been working our way through that section, we've covered 3 portions, which again, my outlining conventions here go from section down to portion. So the first portion I titled, The Divine King is Openly Observed. And that covered everything from the healing of the blind men at Jericho through the arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem and his first visits to the temple. And the reason I call it the Divine King Openly Observed is because that is largely what his purpose is at that time. This is a time when, throughout most of his ministry, he was not trying to very openly proclaim himself as the Messiah. When he gets to Jerusalem here at the end, he is a lot bolder and trying to reveal himself in this way one last time before his crucifixion. And from there we went on to the second portion, which I titled, The Leaders of the Kingdom Lose the Kingdom. And that portion begins with the cursing of the fig tree and continues with Jesus telling 3 parables against the Jerusalem authorities. So kind of an altercation there where they think they're going to challenge his authority, and he reverses the tables on them and challenges their authority and tells 3 pretty hard-hitting parables against them and really exposes them for what they are at that time. So the leaders of the kingdom lose the kingdom, referring to those men, the Jerusalem authorities. And then most recently, we went through the third portion, which I titled The Insightful King Silences the Fools. And that portion featured the answers of Jesus to various questions raised from the various factions of the leaders there in Jerusalem, and ending with his own insightful question. So all the way through, he very much shows his own insight and then brings it back around very much to him, his identity as the Messiah, as the Son of God, as the King and Judge of God's kingdom. So all of that we have seen so far in Matthew section 6. Today we're ready to move further into Matthew by studying a new portion, and that is the 4th portion of Matthew section 6. So if you're doing any kind of outlining on your own as I go through all of this, now is the time to start a new portion. This portion is pretty easy to recognize. I know I can get pretty detailed on how I've divided up Matthew from time to time, but this one is very simple. Matthew 23. That's it. It is Matthew 23. All of that chapter and only that chapter is this 4th portion that I'm talking about here. As soon as Christ finishes his discussion with the leaders of Jerusalem, he turns to address the crowds about some of those leaders that he's just been talking to. And he talks to them, the crowds and his disciples, about those leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees in particular. These are the groups of men that he really targets in this particular chapter. All of that starts at the very beginning of Matthew 23. And then after saying what he has to say, Jesus leaves the temple to deliver a private sermon to his disciples, which is clearly its own portion. That's the Olivet Discourse. So the breaks here are very, very clear. This is a very distinct portion. Matthew 23 is one of those chapters where whoever divided these up into chapters did a very good job of minding what was actually happening, because this is very much a distinct portion of Matthew in and of itself. So in that regard, it's very easy. Now, I've titled this 4th portion, The Heirs of Moses Guide the People to Condemnation. So we're continuing very much with some of these heavier ideas that we see here at this point in Matthew as Jesus comes into Jerusalem for his final visit before his crucifixion. The heirs of Moses guide the people to condemnation. And the heirs of Moses, that's my way of referring to the scribes and Pharisees based on things Jesus says about them. But also, they're not leading the people anywhere good. They're leading them to condemnation. Now, today's message is going to introduce you to this portion and show you why I title it the way I do. I think by the time I get through all of this, very much a kind of bird's eye view of the chapter, you will see why I call it what I do. I have 5 headings for the sermon today, which again I will tell you those so you can follow along a little easier as I get moving. So first of all, this portion is a sermon from Jesus giving 3 warnings to 3 distinct audiences. So he targets 3 different groups, and to each of them he issues a warning. So that's the outline of the portion as we move into it there. And then secondly, this sermon by Jesus, though strongly worded, is justifiable. I don't often bother with defending Jesus, but in this case I will make some statements at least about the rightness of what he does here. And then thirdly, Jesus preaches this sermon primarily to blame the scribes and the Pharisees for God's eventual judgment on Jerusalem. That judgment is some ways out, but Jesus sees all the pieces coming together, and he knows exactly who is chiefly to blame for the way things are going, and he blames the scribes and the Pharisees. And that is the purpose of this portion here, at least to some degree, as Jesus preaches this sermon. And then fourthly, Matthew does something very different from Mark and Luke when he records this sermon by Jesus. So this is very much about comparing what Matthew does as opposed to what Mark and Luke do. And for the most part, my purpose in that 4th heading is to prepare you for the 5th heading, which is Matthew records this sermon as part of his mission to evangelize and disciple the Jews of Israel. So there we move from what Jesus was doing when he preached this sermon to what Matthew had in mind as he recorded this sermon for us and for those of his own time and place. So that is our outline for today's sermon. Now, something for you to consider starting now is that this portion is a great warning to all Christians, whether they are leaders or followers. I know I get very involved in all the details of what was happening back then in that time and place, but I don't mean to take anything away from what we can get out of this, and there is a lot to learn here from this particular portion. Most obviously, the leaders of churches or the leaders of communities of Christians of some sort, the leaders of those kinds of groups can take a warning from this very long rebuke. After all, it is directed primarily against these leaders and trying to warn about the things they do that are wrong and really to expose them in the ways that they're in sin. So anyone who is a leader among Christians in any sense of the word can certainly take a warning from this particular portion. However, the real problem with leaders is that they're always leading somebody else. They're not just, directing themselves in the wrong direction. They're taking other people with them who are following them. And if you are one of those followers, you're going where the leader goes, whoever you're following. And that's going to be good or bad depending on what kind of leader you have. So therefore, as you listen to this sermon, or the later sermons that I have on this portion, you have every reason to listen, no matter who you are, whether you consider yourself a leader or a follower, or if you don't know what you are, one way or another, you're falling under these things here. These are things that we should all mind and should all commit to our own memories and remember these things for the future as we seek to serve Christ. Just because we're living on this side of the cross doesn't mean we have everything right. We can fall into some of these same kinds of pitfalls that they have here. And so we want to avoid that for sure. So that's something for you to keep in mind as we go through this particular portion of Matthew. So let's get ready to tackle that first heading that I gave you. This portion is a sermon from Jesus giving 3 warnings to 3 different audiences. And of course I plan to read all 3 of those warnings, the entire chapter really, as we get moving through this. And what I'm really doing under this heading is I'm giving you an outline for the whole chapter, for the whole portion of Matthew here. So again, those of you that enjoy outlining as much as I do, this is something you'll really want to listen to if you're making notes on these kinds of things. So 3 warnings. Let's talk about each of them individually. Jesus begins this sermon with a warning to the crowds and his disciples about the scribes and Pharisees. So there's your first audience, the crowds and the disciples. And the warning that he gives them is about the scribes and the Pharisees. Let's read verses 1 through 12, which is this first warning. It says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples," there you have it right there, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets, and the chief seats at the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called Rabbi by men. But do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. Okay, so there's our first warning. And that last statement made by Jesus in that warning implies that his chief warning about the scribes and the Pharisees is that they seek to exalt themselves. He talks about those who exalt themselves will be humbled, those who humble themselves will be exalted. So he gets around there to making this final statement. And I think that really shows you the chief theme of what he has to say about the scribes and the Pharisees, that they seek to exalt themselves in all that they do. So there is the first warning that Jesus gives, and he gives that one to the crowds and his disciples. Now, after warning the crowds and the disciples, Jesus turns his attention to his second audience, which is the scribes and the Pharisees themselves. So now instead of talking about these men, he's going to talk directly to those men and issue his second warning. And when Jesus addresses them directly, he rebukes them in a series of accusations very similar to each other. This particular passage here has very much a formula to it as Jesus moves through it. So it's all very much the same kind of thing. Most notably, each of these accusations begins with the word woe. Okay? Now, because that word is used so often and because it's so important, I want to make sure that the younger people here understand what that word means and what I'm saying when I say the word woe. So this is not the word woe that you use when you want someone to stop doing something, like whoa, 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 stop. It's not that kind of woe. Okay? This kind of woe is spelled differently. For those of you that are getting used to this whole spelling thing, this is one of those confusing things you have to deal with as you learn to spell. This is a word spelled differently. It sounds the same, but it's a different word. This woe refers to great sorrow or great trouble coming upon you. That is what we mean by woe when we talk about this kind of woe. So when Jesus rebukes these scribes and Pharisees, he's warning them to expect great sorrow from God for their sins. Things are not going to end well for these guys. Their future is full of woe, of great sorrow. So let's read what Jesus has to say to these men in this second warning. This is verse 13 through 36. So this is the longest passage within this portion, for sure. It says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, and you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive a greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And you say, whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar, swears both by the altar and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple, swears by both the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven, swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, the cup of the dish, so that the outside may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the altar and the temple. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So that is the second warning, and quite a warning it is to those scribes and Pharisees whenever he addresses them directly. Now, Jesus finishes this sermon with a third warning aimed at a new audience. So here at the very end, we come around to another distinct warning with a different audience. This audience is the whole city of Jerusalem. So not just the crowds and the disciples, and not the scribes and the Pharisees alone, but the whole city of Jerusalem. And the implication is the whole city is going to suffer because of the sins of these scribes and Pharisees. And this is what we see at the very end of the chapter, where he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So here at the end, after we finish that third warning, you can see that this sermon from Jesus has three warnings, each directed to a specific audience. So the first warning is to the crowds and the disciples about the scribes and the Pharisees. The second warning is to the scribes and the Pharisees themselves, which makes up the longest warning in this particular portion. And then finally, the third warning is to the city of Jerusalem, where we really see the end of all of these things played out. So there is an outline for you for what we're covering in this particular portion. Okay, now having read the whole portion, you're now ready for my second heading, which is meant to answer a question. And here is the question that very often comes up, at least in the minds of people when they read this particular portion of Matthew. Was it appropriate for Jesus to speak that way about the scribes and the Pharisees? Is this right? Did he go about this the right way? Many have raised that question, and many have answered this question, and some of those people, being critics and rather critical of these kinds of things, have answered that Jesus was out of line to speak that way about them. I know that for those of us who are Christians, that's not the conclusion we come to, but there are quite a few who read this and say, wow, that was way out of line for Jesus to speak that way. Now, as for me, no surprise here, I'm sure, as for me, I think this sermon by Jesus, though strongly worded, is perfectly justifiable. And I have three different observations to make about that. I think each of them in some way justifies how Jesus approaches this as he preaches this particular sermon. My first observation is the tone and intensity of Jesus during this sermon is identical to some of the scriptures endorsed by the scribes and the Pharisees. So again, the tone and intensity of Jesus during this sermon is identical to some of the scriptures endorsed by the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees considered themselves the devotees of the law of Moses primarily. They thought, we are Moses' people here. We follow the law. That was very much the way they identified themselves there in Israel. But they also endorsed the scriptures of the prophets. Unlike some other Jews, we talked about the Sadducees some time ago and how they only accepted the law of Moses. But the scribes and the Pharisees were not like that. They accepted the entirety of what we would call the Old Testament scriptures, so the law and the prophets. They considered themselves people who accepted all of the Word of God. Now, if you have read the Old Testament even once, you know that the sermon preached by Jesus is very much like some of the passages from the Hebrew Scriptures. You go back there maybe to the time of Moses himself or to any of the prophets, they very often have these strongly worded sermons or writings or rebukes of some sort that sound very much like what Jesus is doing here. It is no strange thing at all to be reading the Old Testament and see stuff like that. Therefore, the one group of people who should not be offended by the tone and intensity of Jesus is the scribes and the Pharisees. The people who caught the full force of Jesus' rebuke here, that was the one group of people who could not have objected to the tone and intensity of this sermon by Jesus. The scribes and the Pharisees may be offended at the accusations themselves, but they cannot be offended by the form of those accusations because this is the kind of stuff they read and study on a regular basis. They would say that they endorse all of this from the law and the prophets. So that kind of thing, they're no stranger to it. They would say this is the Word of God. So when Jesus comes to them speaking in much the same way, they can't really object to the way he's talking here. We can stand back and criticize Jesus for not being more polite, but the fact is the scribes and the Pharisees couldn't do that. Jesus was talking to them in the exact way that their own scriptures spoke to them. So really, why are we being all zealous here for the scribes and the Pharisees when they themselves could not have complained about this? Again, maybe they could object to the accusations being made, but the flavor of all this and the strong tone that Jesus has here, they can't object to that. So why be so zealous for them if they're not going to be offended by that particular tone that Jesus takes? That's my first observation. The second observation, and this ties in a little more to things we've been talking about recently in the earlier portion of Matthew, love for other people is only the second greatest commandment. Right? Love for other people, your neighbor, is only the second greatest commandment. Now, sometimes people protest that this sermon by Jesus is contradictory to his recent teachings about love. Some of them asked him, what is the great commandment of the law? He said the greatest commandment is loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he says the second one is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And some people come in here and say, well, Jesus in this sermon here, he's not very loving, is he? So he's going against his own teaching in the way he goes about rebuking these scribes and Pharisees. Well, Jesus does teach us to love our neighbors. That is absolutely true, and you can turn back one chapter in your Bibles and you can see that. Jesus also taught us that the more important commandment is to love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. That is the ranking that he gives. Loving God is the greatest commandment. Loving your neighbor is the second greatest commandment. He is very clear on that particular point. And the critics of Jesus fail to understand this one basic point, that sometimes loving God requires you to speak for God against the wickedness of mankind. Sometimes the love that you have for God, which is supposed to be your primary love, compels you to do things like this here in Matthew 23. And if the wickedness that you're preaching against is very great, then your rebuke must be equally great. If the wickedness is really, really bad, then your words should really, really sting when they come out of your mouth. That is just a matter of proportion. So to read a sermon like this from Jesus and to conclude that Jesus wrongly hates the scribes and Pharisees is to completely miss the point of this sermon. It has flown way over your head. You're not getting at all what Jesus is doing here. The point of the sermon is that God is the enemy of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus is the mouthpiece for God on this occasion. This is just an expression of his own understanding of the will of God and his own zeal for God that compels him to speak out against the sins of these men. And if you do not understand what I just said, there is no way to make you understand it. I think it just comes with knowing the Lord, honestly, which is probably why a great many people find fault with Jesus in this particular sermon. If you know the Lord and you understand what it means to love God and the kind of effect that has on you and the way you have to deal with the world around you and sinners, and especially great sinners, you understand all of this. And I'm just giving a voice to things you already know if you know the Lord. But if you don't understand these things, I can't help you with that. That's all there is to it. And that's my second observation. I do have one thing that justifies the way Jesus goes about this in this particular sermon. For sinners who are eternally stubborn, no criticism is too strong. Okay, so for sinners who are eternally stubborn, no criticism is too strong. Now, for this observation, it's important to remember the big picture. So let's zoom out and have a look at things from a wider perspective. If Jesus' accusations were correct, then these scribes and Pharisees were destined for hell, right? He calls them sons of hell at one point in this and asks them how will they escape these things, all right? So what Jesus predicts for these men is woe, a lot of woe. Many, many woes, in fact. I think there's 8 in particular that are used here, 7 or 8 or so. So that's Jesus' prediction for these men. And if he's right, these men are all heading for eternal condemnation. So these men are so committed to their wickedness that their doom is final, right? There is no, well, if you repent at this point for these particular men. They've gone beyond that. They are flying down this pathway as quickly as they can toward condemnation. Now, here is my question. If somebody is that stubborn in his wickedness, how can you argue that strong words are inappropriate? If they are that committed to sin, why should anyone addressing that sin pull their punches in any way? I doubt that these men suffered any sorrow from the words of Jesus. More likely they experienced anger. I doubt they suffered any sorrow at the words of Jesus. But if they did experience any sorrow, if their feelings were hurt by any of the things Jesus said, that sorrow seems like a natural and right consequence for the wickedness Jesus is talking about in this particular sermon. It all seems to flow together. Sin brings wrath. Okay, if you're a great sinner, you get great wrath. And any sermon about that is going to reflect that, which means it's not going to be a nice sermon by any means. So you see, instead of asking about the appropriateness of Jesus' words, what we should really be asking is whether Jesus is correct about these men. Has he rightly assessed their spiritual condition? If so, the question of appropriateness is no longer a question. And really, that better question could be transferred over to another question entirely, and that is Jesus really who he says he is? Is he actually the king of the kingdom of God? Is he actually the judge that God has appointed over the souls of men? If he is, then all other questions are answered, and there's no more reason to complain. You can join these men in their rebellion if you want to, but there's no question anymore about whether Jesus is right and whether his words are appropriate. All of that just goes by the wayside if Jesus is who he says he is, and if he is correct about these men. So all that to say, whichever one of those observations you want to latch onto as your justification for Jesus, what Jesus does here is justifiable. The sermon is strongly worded for sure, but it was perfectly appropriate given what he was trying to do and all that was going into this. So that brings us to the third heading for today. This is the shortest of my divisions for this particular sermon. Now, after studying the sermon from Jesus, I believe that he preached it primarily for the purpose of blaming the scribes and the Pharisees for God's eventual judgment on Jerusalem. He was not just pointing a finger at them and their sins, but he also wants to pin everything on them, the consequences for those sins, which are, the consequences are the eventual destruction of Jerusalem that was coming a few decades later during their rebellion against Rome. Now, don't forget that this sermon ends not with a proclamation of judgment on the scribes and the Pharisees alone, but on the whole city of Jerusalem. There in the last few verses, he definitely zooms out saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to you. And he has these very ominous words for the entire city when he concludes this sermon. Since that passage about Jerusalem at the end is very brief, we might be tempted to treat it as being of lesser importance than the woes that make up the majority of this particular sermon. That would be the temptation we might face. However, I think this warning to Jerusalem comes at the end of this sermon because that was the goal the entire time. That is the thing he was trying to say. He just had to get there. And to get there, he had to detail all these things that the scribes and the Pharisees are doing and how bad they are before he can get to the point of issuing this warning against Jerusalem there at the end of the sermon. So more specifically, Jesus desires to warn Jerusalem that the scribes and the Pharisees will be the primary cause of their destruction. When that city actually gets leveled, and leveled it was eventually, they have one group of people to thank for that, and that is the scribes and the Pharisees. Now this blame may seem a little bit tenuous, like really? We're going to blame the destruction of that entire city on these two groups of people, the scribes and the Pharisees. Is that fair? Well, it may seem tenuous until we consider the greater influence that the scribes and the Pharisees had on the nation, just how much sway they had over the people at that time. While the priesthood worked in the temple and the eldership managed the governmental business that was there, it was the scribes who taught the people in the synagogues every Sabbath, week after week, and it was the Pharisees who modeled their form of righteousness for all the nation and were regarded as the holiest of the holy. It really is the scribes and the Pharisees at the front of the line when it comes to the spiritual direction of the nation. They are the ones leading the people in this particular direction that they are going. So yes, the whole city is doomed, but the city is doomed because there are blind people being led by blind hypocrites who seek only their own exaltation. And everyone's playing this game of follow the leader, and it's not going to end well. So that is what I think Jesus' purpose is in preaching this sermon, not just to rebuke the scribes and the Pharisees, but to point out the consequences for their sins and the way they are leading the nation. They are leading the nation, that city in particular, Jerusalem, to destruction. And Jesus wants to pin all of that on them. Okay, so this brings me to my fourth heading, which is a little more fact-oriented, I guess you could say. The fourth heading today is really meant to prepare you for my last heading, but before we can get there, I've got to lay out all of these details for you and prepare you for that. So here we go. I want to show you that Matthew does something very different from Mark and Luke when he records this sermon by Jesus. All three of those men record Jesus saying something about the Pharisees at this particular point in his ministry, but they do it a little bit differently than Matthew does, and I want to show you that. Now, in Mark's gospel at this time in the ministry of Jesus, Mark records a much briefer warning from Jesus about the scribes, okay? So you don't have to go there necessarily if you don't want to, but I'm going to turn to Mark and read for you what happens there. So this is Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 40. So only three verses there in Mark chapter 12, where Mark comes around and records something at this point. But here's what he records. In his teaching, Jesus was saying, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." The end. That is all Mark says. Now, several differences are evident here. In Mark's version, Jesus addresses the crowds only and does not address the scribes and the Pharisees directly. He talks about the scribes, but he's addressing this to the crowds around him. Also, the warning of Jesus is only about the scribes and not about the Pharisees. So the Pharisees just kind of get off easy as Mark tells the story here. And finally, as I did imply, this is much shorter here in Mark than what we see over in Matthew. So several differences here. It's the same time and place if you compare Matthew and Mark. It's there in Jerusalem at the end of his ministry, very much teaching against the scribes at this point, but a lot of differences there. Now in Luke's gospel, he does almost exactly what Mark does. And just for the record, I will read to you what Luke does. Again, you don't have to turn there. But this is Luke chapter 20, verses 45 through 47. practically identical to what Mark does. So Luke writes this. Okay. Do we have a problem here? Luke 20:45. Here we go. And while all the people were listening, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive a greater condemnation." Pretty much exactly what we see over in Mark's gospel. So Mark and Luke kind of do the same thing. Matthew's doing something kind of different in his gospel. Now, right now, you might be wondering whether any other gospel records something more like Matthew. Does Mark, does Luke, does John, do they include anything more like what Matthew does? Well, as a matter of fact, Luke's gospel does record a list of woes directed to the Pharisees and the lawyers, who I think are basically the same thing as scribes. I've made that argument in the past, but just for the record, I think they're the same basic thing. But Luke does record a series of woes issued from Jesus against the Pharisees and the lawyers earlier in the ministry of Jesus. And I do want to read that to you. That is Luke chapter 11, if you want to turn there again. But I will read that for you at least, just so you can hear the similarities there. This again is kind of a long passage, but I do want to read it for you here. Luke 11, verses 37 through 54. Okay, so, now when he had spoken, a Pharisee asked him to have lunch with him, and he went in and reclined at the table. And when the Pharisee saw it, he was surprised that Jesus had not first ceremonially washed before the meal. But the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but inside of you, you are full of robbery and wickedness. You foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give that which is within as charity, and all things are clean for you. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and rue and every kind of garden herb, and yet disregard justice and the love of God. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the chief seats in the synagogues and the respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like concealed tombs, and the people who walk over them are unaware of it." One of the lawyers said to him in reply, "Teacher, when you say this, you insult us too." But he said, "Woe to you, lawyers, as well, for you weigh men down with burdens hard to bear, while you yourselves will not even touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets, and it was your fathers who killed them. So you are witnesses and approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them, and you build their tombs. For this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, and some of them they will persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the house of God. Yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation. Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves did not enter, and you hindered those who were entering." When he left there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to be very hostile and to question him closely on many subjects, plotting against him to catch him in something he might say. All right, so there is Luke's record of these woes. Now, the similarities with Matthew's list of woes is evident. It's pretty clear. A lot of the same material, same basic structure, woe, 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 on down the line. But Luke has so many different details that it seems to be a different event. In Luke, the scene is a dinner with the Pharisees and the lawyers. They're just there lounging at tables, having eaten. Whereas in Matthew, the scene is the temple. This is him in Jerusalem there at the very end of his ministry. In Luke, Jesus is prompted to rebuke the Pharisees because of their traditions about washing, and really because he himself did not ceremonially wash, and the Pharisee there was surprised at that. Meanwhile, in Matthew, Jesus preaches his sermon as a part of his final confrontation there in Jerusalem. In Luke, the flow is more like a dialogue, with one of the lawyers interrupting Jesus, and the whole thing started with the Pharisee being surprised there. It's more like a back and forth. Whereas in Matthew, Jesus is just preaching a sermon. He's just going, and no one interrupts him. So, very different kind of details there, enough to say that this is a different event maybe earlier on in Jesus' ministry, and Luke records that event, and Matthew records another similar event later on. And I wanted you to know about all that, these other passages from other Gospels, to show you that Matthew does something very different from Mark and Luke when he records this sermon by Jesus. This is one of these ways in which Matthew is just going his own direction, as opposed to what Mark and Luke do in this particular case. Whereas Mark and Luke are content to record a brief version of the warning about the scribes, Matthew wants you to read the whole sermon Jesus preached against the scribes and the Pharisees together. So Matthew wants you to have the fuller story and the fuller account of what happened at that time. Also, while Luke chose to record an earlier set of woes directed at the Pharisees and lawyers, Matthew chose to record a later set of woes against those men. So it seems that Matthew really wanted us to have one last long look at those scribes and Pharisees just before the arrest and murder of Jesus. He wants these things to be recorded here and now at this time in the ministry of Jesus, and he wants you thinking about them at this time, not earlier. And he wants you to think about all of it and not just a small part of it, like Mark and Luke give you. Okay, so with that information, you're now ready for the fifth and final heading, I think. So this will be the last thing I say today. Matthew records this sermon as part of his mission to evangelize and disciple the Jews of Israel. So here we're zooming out to Matthew's overall purpose with this entire gospel. Now, this last heading is, of course, framed around another form of asking why, as we go through all of this and ask, well, why this, why that, why is this here? In this case, why did Matthew record this sermon when no one else did? Why did he record it when Mark and Luke do not record this exact sermon? Well, my answer is Matthew recorded this sermon as an appropriate warning for the Jews of Israel living in his own day. So when Matthew wrote, it would have been a few decades later after the time of Jesus, but Matthew thought to himself as he was putting this gospel together, this is the kind of thing that my people need to read at this time. It's just as relevant as it was back then, so we're going to include this in my gospel. Now, I've often said that certain features of Matthew's gospel only make sense if we assume that he wrote it for Jews, especially Jews living in Israel. That's an argument that I've been making pretty well continually throughout this gospel, and I think it holds true here as well. I think this sermon by Jesus is another example of that, in which you see that Matthew's audience and his own intentions for his gospel is very much coloring what he decides to record and the way he records it. Perhaps Mark's readers and Luke's readers have no reason to care about the details regarding the scribes and the Pharisees. After all, we don't get the impression that Mark and Luke are recording their gospels for the same audience as Matthew does, probably a Gentile audience in view for both Mark and Luke. But if Matthew wrote to the Jews of Israel, this sermon would have been an appropriate warning for his own readers who were still following the scribes and the Pharisees at that time. The situation in Israel among the Jews really was not that different than what it was when Jesus was still walking around and preaching. Now, perhaps Luke's readers could have afforded to classify these woes merely under the conflict of Jesus with the scribes and the Pharisees and just sort of treat it as, yeah, that's the kind of thing Jesus was doing back then. But Matthew's readers, if they were indeed the Jews of Israel, could not afford to be academic about this. This wasn't just a matter of history for them. This was about their own ongoing spiritual condition. The beloved city of their nation, Jerusalem, was under threat of divine judgment because of those scribes and Pharisees. And for those people who were living in Jerusalem or around Jerusalem, like the Jews of Israel in Matthew's time, you can't just say, oh yes, Jesus said this at one point. It's like, no, this is an important warning here. Like, this is like targeted at us. This matters for us, this thing that Jesus said and that Matthew has recorded for us. In that case, the full sermon preached in Jerusalem, ending with its warning to Jerusalem, was very much appropriate and very necessary for Matthew to record for his own audience. And so this fourth portion of Matthew, section 6, makes its own contribution to Matthew's greater purpose to evangelize and disciple his people. He included it for that reason. You see, the scribes and the Pharisees, outlived the ministry of Jesus. They didn't just, disappear when Jesus was crucified. They kept on going. And the scribal form of religion became stronger and stronger after the time of Jesus. That was the trend. The whole priestly and cultic aspect of things there in the temple very much dwindled, and the scribal aspects and the pharisaical aspects really grew stronger after the time of Jesus. And after the temple was destroyed, when Jerusalem was destroyed, Judaism became even more scribal. It very much became all about, getting these fine details down of what we should do in this case and what we should do in this case, and all these different traditions that were there. Modern day Orthodox Judaism is the great-grandchild of the scribes and the Pharisees. It exists in one big line. It has continued to this present day. The scribes and the Pharisees certainly did not go away after the time of Jesus. At whatever stage in that process, the Jews of Israel needed to hear a criticism about the scribes and the Pharisees because it would directly affect them and their way of living and their conceptions of what it means to serve God. Any of Matthew's readers who heed the warning will escape the condemnation that comes with following these blind hypocrites. If they read these things and say, whoa, Jesus is making good points there, I better get on a different direction here from what these scribes and Pharisees are doing, that's a good thing. They will escape that condemnation. Jesus later on tells people to get out of Jerusalem when they see certain things happening. Those are the kinds of people that are going to follow that warning, those who realize that they've been going a wrong way and it's time to get off that track and get to doing something different. If they read this gospel soon enough, they may have escaped Jerusalem before it became the calamity, to put it delicately, that city suffered at the hands of the Romans and at the hands of the men rebelling against the Romans at that time. Those who read these words from Matthew and applied it to themselves, just as they should have applied it to themselves, could escape those things. So for Matthew, it's very much about generating a repentance that not only has a spiritual value, but a physical value as well, as in your life might be spared if you heed this sermon by Jesus recorded by Matthew. So I think all of that is what was going on in Matthew's mind and why he recorded the full sermon, why he recorded it here, and what he was thinking as he was putting his gospel together. Okay, so that was the fifth and final thing I had to tell you there. Well, as I said at the beginning, I've titled this entire fourth portion, "The Heirs of Moses Guide the People to Condemnation." That is very much the theme, really, of today's sermon to some degree, but certainly of the entire portion. And to explain all of that and get you started in this particular portion, I gave you 5 headings. I'll review those now just so you can have them as a summary here at the end. This portion is a sermon from Jesus giving 3 warnings to 3 different audiences. So first of all, to the crowds and the disciples, secondly, to the scribes and the Pharisees, and then finally to the entire city of Jerusalem. Secondly, this sermon by Jesus, though strongly worded, is justifiable. There are several observations we can make to show us that Jesus is doing the right thing here. He is not by any means out of line. Thirdly, Jesus preached this sermon primarily to blame the scribes and the Pharisees for God's eventual judgment on Jerusalem. Even if the people of Jerusalem generally are in sin, they are in sin because they were following the leadership of these men who were leading them in a very wrong direction. Fourthly, Matthew does something very different from Mark and Luke when he records this sermon by Jesus. Whereas Mark and Luke record only a summary of this sermon, Matthew records the entire sermon, or at least a huge chunk of it, more so than what Mark and Luke do. And then fifthly, based on all of that, I made some statement about what I think Matthew is doing here, and I said that he records this sermon as part of his mission to evangelize and disciple the Jews of Israel. It really was an appropriate warning for them, especially as the shadow of judgment against Jerusalem was still looming over them after the time of Jesus. So all of this is strongly rooted to the time and place of Jesus, very much talking about these men back then and the sins that they were committing. However, the sermon is more basically an expose for a problem that is universal and timeless, which is a form of religion that favors self-exaltation over humility, hypocrisy over sincerity, and unexamined tradition over true insight into the ways of God. Those things are always happening. They're happening in churches. They're happening among people who name the name of Christ. These things are always happening. And for that reason, it is still very relevant today. Even those of us who are not living in and around Jerusalem before the days of the Roman siege and the rebellion against the Romans back then, even now it is important for us. And I hope this portion will provide us all with the same kind of warning that it provided to those who first heard it. And I hope we will all heed that warning as we go through this portion. So that is all I had to say to you today. We usually do a time of comments if anyone has them, or questions. I will try to answer them. In a sermon like this, I might be telling you wait for a later sermon because we're just getting into all of these things. But if there is a question I can answer now, I'll answer it, or you can just share whatever is on your mind.